Hello, this is the last of the set of videos on the Universal House of Justice and the Guardianship from an old manuscript of mine on the Universal House of Justice in the Baha'i world from 1963 to 1973. As with all of the videos in this series, the main reference book is the Messages from the House of Justice, Universal House of Justice, 1963-1986. I'll give the details of that below, and there's also an old article that I co-wrote with Moojan Momen on the Baha'i faith 1957-1988, which provides some context. As I've said in the previous videos in this set, the Universal House of Justice was first elected in 1963 and soon announced that it could find no way in which a second guardian could be appointed to succeed Sheikh Effendi. And two facts remained to trouble the thinking of many Baha'is. First, Abdul Baha referred to a line of guardians, but the line had ended abruptly after the first incumbent. And the Universal House of Justice and the Guardianship had been envisaged as twin institutions which would function together in a complementary manner. Responding to these uncertainties, the House of Justice composed three major letters on the issues involved, and will now turn to the last of these three, dated the 7th of December 1969. The House's third major letter on matters relating to the Guardianship in the House of Justice was addressed to an individual Baha'i in reply to questions raised by a youth study group. It was again given wide circulation as the points it raised were evidently felt to be of major significance. The House hoped that its elucidations would help the Baha'is understand these matters more clearly, but counselled that too little time had as yet elapsed since the Baha'i system had come into being for its functioning and potentialities to be fully understood. The letter deals with four topics. First, the unity of meaning in the Baha'i writings. Secondly, the relationship between the Guardianship and the Universal House of Justice. Thirdly, two authoritative centres. And finally, the Universal House of Justice, how does it function in the absence of a guardian? As to the first, unity of meaning, one of the questions raised by the person the letter was addressed to was how to reconcile two passages in the authoritative Baha'i texts. And before dealing with the specific issues raised, the House asserted the essential unity of meaning of those texts. There could never be any real contradictions between them. Thus, Abdul Baha's will and testament did not in any way contradict the Kitab al-Aqdas of Baha'u'llah, but rather confirmed, supplemented, and correlated its provisions. Similarly, the writings of Sheikh Effendi did not contradict the revealed words of Baha'u'llah or the interpretations of Abdul Baha. Turning now to the relationship between the Guardianship and the House of Justice, as set out in the Baha'i texts, the Guardians and the Universal House of Justice had certain duties and functions in common, whilst each institution also operated within its own exclusive, separate and distinct sphere. Thus, the Guardians interpreted the texts, and the House legislated on matters not expressly revealed in the texts. Within their respective spheres, the pronouncements of each institution were authoritative and binding. According to Sheikh Effendi's own explicit statement, neither institution could or ever would infringe upon the sacred and prescribed domain of the other. Again, given that Abdul Baha stated that both institutions were under the care and protection of Baha'u'llah and the shelter and guidance of the Bab, it was impossible to conceive of them as rival centres of authority in conflict with each other. Both were vehicles of the same divine guidance. Both institutions had general functions beyond their specific responsibilities, and it was in these areas that there were shared duties. Thus, the House also had the general function of protecting and administering the cause, solving obscure questions and deciding upon matters that have caused difference, whilst the guardians were invested with all the powers and prerogatives necessary to protect and lead the faith. According to Abdu'l-Baha's will, each successive guardian would also become a life member and irremovable head of the House of Justice, and as such would take part in its deliberations. This was the context in which to place one of the questions raised by the study group, namely the seeming contradiction between Abdu'l-Baha's statement in his will and testament that the Universal House of Justice was freed from all error, and Shoghi Effendi's statement that it was one of the duties of a guardian to insist that his fellow House members reconsider any enactment that he believed conflicted with the meaning of Baha'u'llah's writings or departed from their spirit. In practice, of course, if there was a living guardian and he called for other House members to reconsider a decision, it was inconceivable that they would ignore his request. It should be remembered, however, that both institutions were divinely guided and protected. It was the final judgment of the House which was guaranteed infallibility, and not any views expressed during the process of consultation which led up to the final decision being taken. A living guardian functioned as a member of the House of Justice and was empowered to ask for decisions to be reconsidered during consultation, but ultimately he was not entitled to overrule a majority decision. In this regard, it was also useful to consider the actual process followed by the House at the present time in making its decisions. It first observed the greatest care in studying the relevant Baha'i texts, as well as considering the views of all its members. Then, after a long period of consultation, it began to draft a pronouncement, but during this process could decide to reconsider the issue, eventually reaching a quite different final decision or postponing legislation altogether for the time being. In the presence of a living guardian, his views would obviously carry great weight during such a process. It was clear from the Baha'i writings that the Baha'is were provided with two authoritative centers to which they should turn after the passing of Baha'u'llah. On the one hand, the book, the Word of God, as revealed by Baha'u'llah's writings and interpreted by the properly appointed and divinely inspired interpreters of those writings, that is Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, and on the other, the Universal House of Justice, which would decide on matters not covered by the divine word and its authoritative extensions. Thus, in his writings, Baha'u'llah both told his followers to refer to his words and to Abdu'l-Baha as his appointed successor, and ordained the future establishment of the house, whilst in his turn Abdu'l-Baha explicitly instituted the guardianship, reaffirmed and elucidated the authority of the house, and again told the Baha'is to turn to the sacred writings. Of these sources of authority, it was clear that the highest was the book, as this delimited the sphere of action of the House of Justice. The House could only legislate on matters not explicitly revealed in the sacred text, and its sphere of legislative action was defined by the authoritative interpreters of the book, that is, Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi. As to the question of the Universal House of Justice in the absence of a guardian, future guardians were clearly envisaged in the Baha'i authoritative texts, but there was no promise or guarantee that the line of guardians would continue indefinitely. Indeed, there were clear indications that the line could be broken, as in the Kitab al-Aqdas itself, which referred to authority over Baha'i charitable endowments, resting first with Baha'u'llah, and then after his passing with his male descendants, and in this instance taken by the House to include the future guardians, and after them the House of Justice itself, if it had been established by them. And finally, in the absence of an elected House of Justice, with the people of Baha who spoke not except by his leave and were the champions of victory. The death of Sheikh Effendi in 1957 precipitated the exact situation which had been provided for in the Actas passage on endowments. That is, the line of guardians had ended before the House had been elected. Without question, this was a grievous loss for the faith, but it did not alter God's purpose or destroy Baha'u'llah's covenant. There was, after all, a repeated insistence that the Baha'i covenant was indestructible and God's purpose for humanity in this day immutable. On the specific relationship between guardianship and the House, whilst the guardians were clearly intended to have the authority to define the House of Justice's sphere of legislative action, this did not mean that the House would stray beyond its proper sphere of action without such guidance. To the contrary, other texts made it clear that the House would be infallible and would never infringe on the guardian's domain of action. Specifically, the infallibility of the House was independent of the guardian's membership of it or his presence at its sessions. Both Abdul Baha and Sheikh Effendi had explicitly stated that its elected members would receive unfailing divine guidance in their consultations, and Sheikh Effendi had also stated that under no circumstances did the guardianship abrogate or detract from the powers granted to the House by Baha'u'llah and confirmed by Abdul Baha. Again, during his 36 years as guardian, Sheikh Effendi had actually already provided guidance as to the House's sphere of action. So, many thanks for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. You're very welcome to support my channel if you so wish. Please do like, comment and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give a Patreon link below in case you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll move on to a new chapter on the hands of the cause and related institutions. Have a good day.